Can you hear me, Laura? In the face of the Arab Spring, the Turkish case is increasingly contested within and beyond the borders of Turkey, the country itself. On the one hand, it has often been idealized as a model of a secular democracy for the rest of the Muslim world. The integration of a very strong Islamist movement into the secular state and the free market economy has created this strong image of a more democratic Turkey. On the other hand, however, we hear increasingly more about Turkey as a divided country, divided over issues of minority, women's and human rights, as well as issues of freedom violations, particularly individual freedoms and freedom of expression. It's ironic that a country shifts so rapidly between a model of democracy, secular democracy, and a torn country divided by all of these issues. So instead of juxtaposing these two images, these two problematic images against each other, my work highlights the continuity between them. Today I have three main objectives. First, I'm going to discuss two main trends in Turkish politics, which I call the politics of engagement and the politics of contestation between Muslims, pious Muslims, and the secular state, which I argue are the two inseparable parts of the same political transition. And then I will situate current freedom violations into this larger political context in Turkey. So before I begin my discussion, let me clarify one issue. Each time I discuss politics and Islam in Turkey, I'm asked specifically if I'm talking about the Gülen movement, the largest and most internationally influential movement, or the JDP. And this question is not an innocent one. I'm being asked, actually critically, because I happen to analyze both of these groups in the same book, my first book. And there's a particular reason why they can and why they cannot be analyzed in the same study. The reason that I analyze both of these groups together between Islam and the state is because I wasn't interested in a particular group. I was interested in a form of politics, the politics of engagement that I will discuss today. And at that time, during the first term of the JDP, AKP's government, both groups were actually displaying the similar politics of engagement. They were merging in their pattern of politics and engagement with the state. But I highlighted that there were no overlapping memberships, with a few exceptions. There is one more reason why we could actually analyze these two groups together, which I will do today in a couple of minutes, and that's their historically specific location towards the secular state. And I'm going to talk about that, but both of these groups are nationalist groups, and their relationship, their bondage with the secular republic is historically specific and cannot be easily compared to many other Islamist groups in other countries. In my previous work, my first book, Between Islam and the State, I followed the largest Gülen movement, the largest Islamic movement in Turkey, from Turkey to Kazakhstan and to the United States. And my goal was to explore the patterns of interaction and negotiation between ordinary Muslims, not the state elite, but the ordinary Muslims with the secular state in and beyond the Turkish state. So in 1990s, these interactions that I'm going to depict in a minute were unusual. They were surprising because the secular Republic of Turkey, founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, has always had an antagonistic relationship with Islam and Islamists. Previous scholarship on Islam throughout the 1990s has juxtaposed Islamists against secular states and against the West. Similarly, in Turkish studies, two prophecies were competing at that time. Either the Turkish state was expected to destroy this Islamist movement, or the Islamists were expected to overthrow the Turkish state. And my work differed from these two zero-sum games. My ethnography provided a different picture. I argued that state-Islam interaction was moving from confrontation to engagement. I noticed this shift in the least expected sides of everyday life, such as high school dormitories, in university campuses, in tea houses, chayhane, instead of in the parliament at that time. So in contrast to the predominant emphasis on confrontation, I found the Turkish Islamists, this is still 1990s, non-resistant and non-confrontational. But most importantly, they were developing national sentiments, nationalistic sentiments, when scholarly attention was still on the strategic anti-state Islamic mobilization. I was taken by their elective affinities, effective ties, their developing national belonging to the secular republic. So what do I mean by the politics of engagement? I use engagement as an umbrella term to refer to contestation in the area of education, negotiation of the boundaries between religion and politics, hence the terms of secularism, and cooperation and alliance in ethnic and gender politics. And this is all between Muslim actors, ordinary Muslim people, and the secular state. To make this concrete, let me share an anecdote from my fieldwork in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where the Gülen movement has concentrated its activities in schools. In one of the associations of the Gülen movement, I was noticing a group of gentlemen who were visiting every day, and their visits were turning this place into a coffee house or a cultural center where they drank Turkish coffee and tea, they laughed and talked about politics and joked and discussed their family life. And to my surprise, after a couple of weeks, I found out that these gentlemen were not Turkish Islamists. They were the teachers of the Turkish state who were appointed to Kazakhstan to teach Kazakh kids Turkish culture, language, and history. So I realized that the Gülen movement and the secular Turkish state were not only collaborating outside the Turkish borders, but they were also sharing similar international agendas. Well, in this case, it happens to be Turkishizing Central Asia. So I argued that these international collaborations empower the pious Muslims of Turkey and help them integrate into international economic networks and markets. I would like to say a couple of words about the unintentionality of this politics of engagement, which is different from strategic mobilization, strategic decision-making, which are predominant perspectives in studies of Islam and politics, particularly in political science. The Turkish case challenges previous scholarship on Islam and democracy, which either applauded Islam and its compatibility with democracy by highlighting its presumed qualities like egalitarianism, justice, and liberal attitudes. Or the same literature juxtaposed pit Islam and Islamists against democracy by arguing that it was an enemy of civil society, democracy, secular nation-state, nationalism, etc. So this was a very polarized literature. And parting ways with both of these polarized camps, I argue that the engagement between Islam and the state was an unintended aspect of the well-organized Islamic activities. Accordingly, the politics of engagement has facilitated democratization accidentally by transforming both the Muslim actors and the secular state. Democratization has been underway in Turkey because of the historical specificities of state-Islam interaction and the national loyalties of the Islamic Muslim actors, and not because of their liberal and democratic practices and goals. In this regard, the gender politics in the Gülen movement is very telling. My ethnography revealed that Islamic male elite and the secular male elite in Turkey have bonded over their similar gender politics, unintendedly. There is nothing strategic, there is nothing tactical about it. Nobody sits down and conspires against women about how to exclude them. This is unintended. And why is it unintended? Because both of these groups, Islamists and secular male elite, resembled and adopted the gender politics of their founding father Atatürk by inserting women into the public sphere, including them in the public sites, and making them visible in the public sites, while also denying them power. in decision making. So basically, my research revealed that women were excluded from the politics of engagement. Hence, I argued that engagements are not necessarily the result of deliberate democratic concerns and actions, but often the effects of shared illiberal goals between Muslim actors and the secular state. Concretely, both the Islamist and secularist male elite collaborated in banning the headscarf by compromising women's agency. This conclusion also suggests that research on Islamic democratization must take alternative linkages seriously. What do I mean by alternative linkages? Most of the research conducted on democratization looks specifically at narrowly defined electoral politics, comparative party politics, or political institutions. Notwithstanding the importance of these issues, I suggest that alternative linkages, the everyday interaction between ordinary Muslim actors, civil society, and the state, in other words, how they interact and negotiate in everyday life, should be taken very seriously. With this goal in mind, my current project follows urban every sites of contestation, which complement my previous work on cooperation and engagement. So why am I interested all of a sudden in the urban sites of contestation? Well, it's probably because most of my colleagues started teasing me by telling me, now that the Islamists are really engaged, you have to start thinking about how to disengage them from power. Similar to my other ethnographies, the main paradox came from my field sites in Turkey. Just as I was becoming a little too comfortable with the politics of engagement, the secularists have begun attacking the pious Muslims both at the state level and on the streets. In the end of April 2007, the pro-Islamic JDP AKP government has nominated Abdullah Gül from its own party to become the first pious president of the secular Turkish Republic. This was immediately followed by the government's warning, muhtıra, in massive, large-scale street protests in the largest cities of Turkey. Since then, urban contestations and divides have continued to deepen. The current situation in Turkey is indeed alarming. Recently, the arrests and unsubstantiated detentions of journalists, academics, and university students have peaked. The jails are full of these people who are allegedly accused of some sort of terrorist activity or conspiring against the state. There are 1,000 cases brought to the European Court of Human Rights. In a response to this crisis, call it crisis of freedoms, two scholarly perspectives appeared. One camp, which I call the discontent of Islam, accused the pious Muslims, the Islamists, for this crisis by arguing that Islamists cannot be tamed by the rules of institutional democracy. They've been in power for a decade and this is the result. The other camp, whom I call the apologetics of Islam, accused the secularist followers of the founding father Kemal Atatürk by arguing that the secularists found the system, it's flawed, it cannot accommodate the pious majority or any other minorities. I argue that both of these perspectives are the result of political partisanship and they're not scholarly analytical enough. So I beg to differ. My current book, Democracy Without Freedom, reveals a different picture. My ethnography suggests that urban sites that I study, neighborhoods, university campuses, and Islamic art scenes, which seem to be deeply divided over Muslim politics, do in fact produce resourceful contestation and negotiation over freedom and civil rights. Although Turkish citizens are no longer afraid of a top-down Islamist Sharia revolution, they are increasingly fearful of a bottom-up Islamization process. Now that pious Muslims are entirely integrated into the city landscape and share the markets and malls and neighborhoods with the secular citizens, and they share bourgeois lifestyles, the seculars feel defensive of their sphere of privacy and freedom. The nationwide debates that Jonathan mentioned, the nationwide debates on neighborhood pressure, we in Turkish we refer it as mahalle baskısı, are symptomatic of these rising fears which lead people to contest, claim, occupy, and even sometimes get obsessed about certain urban sites. Probably Istanbul, the city which has hosted empires, has never been so difficult to share before. This is because ordinary people feel insufficiently protected by law and their state of their ways of life. The recent turn in world politics, particularly the Arab Spring and Occupy movement across the world, have provided substantial support to the locus and focus of my recent work. That is the increasing centrality of urban space in the context of people's decreasing trust to and increasing demands from their state. Turkish studies suffer from a persistent and misleading perception of both the Turkish secular state and its religious society. So in sharp disagreement with those two groups that I just described, the apologetics of Islam and the discontents of Islam, I argue that the axis of conflict in Turkey has shifted from Islam versus secularism. More specifically, Turkey is no longer contesting Islam versus secular democracy, which European countries are increasingly struggling for. Now that Turkey is done with the inclusion of pious Muslims, it has moved to another level of struggle. It's contestation in the aftermath of inclusion. This is not worrisome, because most of the European countries are really challenged by and fail in coping in Muslim accommodation. Hence, contrary to the predominant view that sees urban contestation as a threat to democracy, my findings suggest that this is a test for democracy. It's a good thing. Divided urban sites push efficiently for liberal democracy and a liberal civil society that can secure liberties. Now, this is all abstract. Let me give you an example from my current fieldwork, which I've been conducting since 2007. One of my field sites is a highly divided university campus in Istanbul, which is the most liberal campus and academically the most competitive campus. The faculty and students split deeply over Muslim politics and issues relating to Muslim politics, including but not limited to headscarf controversy. However, the campus unites indiscriminately when it comes to issues of freedom violations, academic freedom violations, government's crackdown on the Kurdish people, or unsubstantiated detentions. And most importantly, these campus-wide protests cross the deep fault lines between the Muslim and secular politics and thereby create new alliances between these previously polarized groups. This is what I call contestation within inclusion. Contestation within inclusion is the aspect of Turkish politics that is most relevant to current European encounters with Muslim immigrants. I'm not a big fan of models because they often tend to represent social and political world as ahistorical and static entities. As I highlighted in the beginning of my talk, Turkish case is very distinct in its historically specific linkages between the pious Muslims and the secular state. Against the wish of the Kemalists to own the secular republic, to monopolize it, the pious Muslims of Turkey have developed very strong allegiance with the state of their nation. Religion and politics cannot be studied without taking this historically evolved ties between the pious and their state, no matter how upsetting this has proved to be for the secularists of Turkey. So the burning question regarding Turkey as the model of a secular democracy is really about this, the freedom violations currently. here's the puzzle. While the JDP integrated entirely into the secular system, in the secular political milieu, secularism has provided no guarantee for liberties and rights. Well, I'm not the only one who's not surprised about it, because many of us in academia don't give credit to secularism the way Enlightenment thinkers did. Secularism needs to be located in a liberal democracy in order to provide those protections. So, in my most recent article in Journal on Democracy, I argued that liberties and rights are no longer safe in Turkey, and this could be a temporary situation if we take care of that soon enough. So, the burning problem is being ignored, because, you know, we've been way too busy celebrating how secular Turkish Muslims became. I think we really need to take a break from that festivity and focus on the major problem. How freedoms and rights will be institutionally secured throughout this major political transition, which forced the old Islamic elite and the old secularist elite and the new Islamic elite to share powers and resources. Well, this is a challenging issue because both the over-empowered JDP government and its weak secularist opposition by CHP, CHP party, are equally uninterested, I repeat, equally uninterested in expanding and securing individual freedoms and rights. They're also equally incapable of discussing, disagreeing, and contesting this in the parliament. So this is why ordinary people take up the fight to the streets. This is why we see so much split and fault lines on the streets in neighborhoods. And this is why we must take the highly contested urban sites very seriously as part of struggles towards democratization. To conclude, current freedom violations in Turkey are not a trivial issue to be ignored by the international community and by the liberal Democrats of Turkey. It needs immediate attention and democratic intervention. At the same time, however, this alarming situation must be analyzed and understood in the larger political context of the politics of engagement and politics of contestation within inclusion. Ironically, if we get this larger picture right, this may locate Turkey ahead of many Western, particularly European countries, which are still trying to cope with the challenge of Muslim accommodation. Thank you very much.